Sherlock Holmes was used to receiving unusual cases, but none had ever been quite as perplexing as the one that now lay before him. It was a chilly November evening when Inspector Lestrade had arrived at 221B Baker Street, his face contorted with frustration. He came bearing an air of defeat, and as always, Holmes greeted him with that sharp, calculating gaze that could dissect the most puzzling of mysteries in a mere glance. "Holmes," Lestrade began, his voice thick with exasperation, "this one's beyond me. I need your help." Holmes raised an eyebrow, gesturing for Lestrade to continue. "It's a murder, Holmes, a terrible, baffling thing. But there's no suspect, no motive, and worst of all, a clue that doesn't make sense." Holmes was intrigued. "Tell me more." Lestrade sat down, his hands trembling as he unrolled a piece of paper. It was a crude sketch of a dagger, a large, ornate thing with a golden hilt. "This was found in the room where the body was discovered." Holmes glanced at the sketch and then back at the inspector, his face unreadable. "A dagger? Golden, you say?" "Yes, it was a golden dagger," Lestrade confirmed. "But that's not the strangest part. The body was found in a locked room, no windows, no other entry points. It's as if the man vanished into thin air. And to make things worse, there's no trace of the weapon. Just this golden hilt lying on the floor, as if dropped by someone who'd never meant for it to be found." Holmes's mind began to whirl with possibilities, but none of them seemed to make sense. He stood, pacing the room, as he turned over the facts in his mind. "Tell me everything about the victim. Who was he?" "Arthur Findlay," Lestrade answered. "A businessman of some repute. Well known in certain circles, but not exactly a man of notoriety. He lived alone in a flat near Covent Garden, though his associates describe him as a man of many secrets. Not much else is known." "And his death?" "Found in his study. The door locked from the inside. No signs of a struggle. The only indication of foul play was a single shallow wound to the chest, a puncture wound. The rest of the room was undisturbed. It's almost as though the killer simply appeared and then vanished without a trace." Holmes sat back down in his armchair, the steam rising from his pipe curling lazily into the air. A locked room mystery. Fascinating. Lestrade fidgeted nervously. "What do you think?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I believe it's an enigma wrapped in riddles." "And this clue," he said, tapping the paper with the sketch of the dagger, "is at the heart of it. A golden dagger, you say? Interesting. But what does it symbolize?" Lestrade shook his head. "That's the part we can't figure out. The weapon doesn't seem to fit with the victim's life. It's far too ostentatious for a man like Findlay." Holmes stood suddenly, his eyes alight with the spark of realization. "Lestrade, you're overlooking something crucial. This is not a crime of passion. This is something far more methodical. A puzzle. And this golden dagger is the key to solving." And without waiting for a reply, Holmes grabbed his coat and gloves, heading for the door. "Come, Lestrade. We're going to Covent Garden." The flat was just as Holmes expected, elegantly furnished, yet filled with a cold emptiness. Arthur Findlay had lived here, but there was little to suggest he had truly lived at all. No personal mementos, no photographs, just expensive decor and neatly arranged bookshelves. Holmes took it all in, his eyes darting around the room with a practiced, almost mechanical precision. Lestrade hovered behind him, looking uncomfortable. "Nothing here seems to make sense, does it?" Holmes didn't answer at first. He was too busy studying a large, ornately framed painting on the wall. It depicted a figure holding a golden dagger, a heroic-looking man dressed in archaic armor. The blade gleamed in the painting as if it had been freshly polished. Holmes took a step back, eyes narrowing. "This," he said slowly, "this painting is more than just decoration." Lestrade looked at him quizzically. "You think it's connected?" "Look closely," Holmes instructed. "The dagger depicted here. See the hilt? It matches the one found at the crime scene. It's a symbol, not just a weapon. Whoever killed Finlay wanted him to see this before he died." Holmes walked over to the desk, running his fingers along the surface. It was meticulously clean except for one detail, a small indentation in the wood near the edge of the desk, just beneath the painting. He knelt down, inspecting it closely. There was something inscribed on the wood, barely visible. "Lestrade," he called over his shoulder, "bring me the magnifying glass." The inspector complied, handing over the tool. Holmes carefully examined the engraving, his brow furrowing as he deciphered the faded letters. "The curse of the Golden Dagger," he muttered, "and it's dated yesterday." Lestrade's eyes widened. "A curse? You think that's what this is about?" Holmes stood and turned to face him, his expression grim. "No, Lestrade. I think someone is trying to create a story, a narrative, a tale of mystery and intrigue. But someone is not just killing for pleasure. They're leaving behind clues to torment those who investigate. And we've fallen right into their trap." The game was afoot, and Holmes could already feel the pull of the case deep in his gut. The Golden Dagger wasn't just a symbol, it was a message, a deliberate piece of the puzzle meant to mislead them at every turn. As the two men left the flat, Holmes' mind raced with the possibilities. This was no ordinary murder, it was a deliberate challenge. A challenge that, with enough patience and logic, he would soon unravel. And once again, the great detective would prove that no puzzle was beyond his reach. But somewhere, someone was waiting for him to make his next move. The drive to the local police station was a quiet one, the muted hum of the carriage wheels on, the cobblestone streets matching the contemplation in Holmes's mind. Lestrade, for once, was unusually silent, his mind still trying to process the revelations Holmes had uncovered. The inspector had no doubt that there was something significant about the curse of the Golden Dagger, but the pieces were still scattered and elusive. They both knew that the path ahead was fraught with misdirection, but only one thing was certain. The killer, whoever they were, had made one critical mistake. The moment they arrived at the station, Holmes was met by the constable in charge of securing Finlay's flat. "Mr. Holmes, sir," the constable began nervously, holding up a small piece of paper. "We found this in the victim's coat pocket. We thought you might like to have a look." Holmes took the paper, studying it with a practiced eye. It was a business card, plain and simple, except for the fact that the name printed on it was entirely unfamiliar. "Randolph Stroud, antiquities dealer," Holmes read aloud. Strange that the victim would be carrying this. What connection did he have with Stroud? Lestrade, frowning, stepped closer. Could it be another lead, then? Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned the card over in his fingers, noticing a faint imprint, an odd texture that appeared to have been recently pressed into the surface. It was subtle, but to Holmes it was another clue, one that no one else would have noticed. "Lestrade, I think our next stop should be Stroud's shop." Randolph Stroud's Antiquities Emporium was tucked away on a narrow side street off the Strand, the faded sign above the door swaying gently in the breeze. The place looked harmless enough, with its quaint windows stacked with old books, worn, sculptures and dusty trinkets. But as Holmes stepped inside, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, as though the very walls were hiding secrets that wanted to remain buried. Stroud himself was a man in his late 50s, with a sparse patch of silver hair and a look of quiet disinterest. He was bent over a counter, inspecting a small artifact with a magnifying glass, and he barely glanced up as the two men entered. Holmes approached the counter, his eyes scanning the shelves, the scattered pieces of history, while Lestrade took a more direct approach, introducing himself. "Mr. Stroud, we're investigating the murder of Arthur Finlay. We found your business card on the victim's person. Do you know him?" Stroud's reaction was immediate, though subtle enough that only Holmes caught it. The briefest flicker of tension in his shoulders, the slight hesitation in his voice. "Finlay," Stroud said, his tone level, but a touch too calm. "I know of him, of course. He was one of my regular customers. A collector of fine antiques. But I haven't seen him in weeks. I'm afraid I don't know much more than that." Holmes stepped forward, fixing Stroud with his penetrating gaze. "You seem nervous, Mr. Stroud. Are you certain you've told us everything?" Stroud's face remained neutral, but the fingers that had been holding the magnifying glass trembled, ever so slightly. It was enough of a tell for Holmes to press further. "The card you gave Finlay, it seems strange that he'd carry it with him in his pocket, don't you think? Especially when it's so easily traceable." Stroud stiffened. "I don't know what you mean. I provide business cards to all my clients. It's hardly an unusual occurrence." Lestrade, sensing the rising tension, spoke up. "Perhaps you could tell us if Finlay bought anything from you recently, anything of particular interest." Stroud paused, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "He did inquire about an artifact I had in my possession, an antique dagger, a relic from a far-off culture, but I'm afraid he didn't purchase it. His interest leaned more towards the mundane, I'm afraid." Holmes stepped back, considering the implications of Stroud's words. "A dagger, you say?" "Yes, but it's long gone now," Stroud replied quickly. "I sold it weeks ago to a private buyer." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who was this buyer?" Stroud's lips pressed together in an almost imperceptible frown, but he spoke nonetheless. "A gentleman named Edward Langdon. He collects rare and valuable weapons." Lestrade glanced at Holmes, a silent question hanging between them. "This could be worth following up then," he said. Holmes, however, wasn't convinced. He had caught something in Stroud's delivery, the slight shift in his posture, the forced calm. Stroud was hiding something. But what? "I'd like to see." "The records of your recent sales, Mr. Stroud," Holmes said smoothly, "and any correspondence with Mr. Langdon. It's vital to the investigation." Stroud hesitated, but then, realizing that refusal would only draw suspicion, he reluctantly agreed. He led them to a small back office where several shelves were filled with ledgers and various artifacts. Holmes's eyes darted across the room, absorbing every detail, but it was the desk that caught his attention. A thin layer of dust rested atop the wooden surface, except for one spot, directly in front of the chair where Stroud had been sitting. The dust there was disturbed, as though something had been recently moved. Holmes's sharp mind raced, but his outward demeanor remained calm. Stroud, apparently unaware of the significance of the detail, began flipping through the ledger, searching for the relevant entry. Meanwhile, Holmes's gaze wandered back to the shelves of artifacts. He paused, his eyes narrowing as they fell upon a peculiar item tucked in a corner. A small, intricately carved box. Its surface gleamed with an almost unnatural sheen. Holmes took a few steps toward it, examining the carvings. There was something strangely familiar about it, as if it had been designed with a specific purpose in mind. The box had no label, no identifying mark. It was an oddity in a store full of relics. Turning back to Stroud, Holmes said, "I would also like to inspect that box, Mr. Stroud. It might hold the key to something you're not telling us." Stroud's eyes flickered to the box, and for a moment, Holmes saw something flash across the antiquities dealer's face, something akin to panic. But it was gone in an instant, buried beneath his usual mask of professionalism. The game was afoot once again, and Holmes was certain they were closing in on something crucial. The dagger, the box, the curious reaction from Stroud, all of it was beginning to fit together in a way that only he could see. But there was still one piece missing, and he knew without a doubt that it would be found in the most unexpected place. The box had turned out to be nothing more than a harmless trinket, a small wooden chest, intricately carved, but devoid of any immediate significance. Stroud's reaction had been revealing, however. The way his eyes lingered on it for just a moment too long suggested there was more to the object than he was willing to admit. But Holmes, knowing that the man was not yet ready to crack under pressure, decided to move on for the time being. He had enough for now. The box, like many things in Stroud's shop, could wait. By the time they left Stroud's Antiquities Emporium, Holmes felt the familiar sense of urgency that accompanied every case. He had observed much, but there were still too many unknowns, too many inconsistencies, and the key to solving this mystery lay in finding those discrepancies and understanding their meaning. Lestrade was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of concrete evidence. "So we've got nothing solid, Holmes. No weapon, no motive, no clear suspect. What now?" Holmes stopped in his tracks, looking up at the sky, the evening fading into a cold, overcast twilight. "Lestrade, the puzzle is here in the details. Every contradiction we uncover, every inconsistency will bring us closer. We just need to focus on the right voices." The two men made their way back to the station, where the key witnesses, those who had been closest to Arthur Findlay in his final days, awaited questioning. Holmes had no doubt that somewhere in their words, hidden beneath layers of politeness or nervousness, would lie the truth. It was simply a matter of listening, truly listening, to what they said, and, more importantly, to what they didn't say. The first to be questioned was Findlay's longtime assistant, a woman named Margaret Hale. She had been employed by Findlay for over 5 years and was described by his associates as a loyal and efficient worker. Her presence was calm, composed, but there was a tightness to her demeanor, a stiffness in her movements that Holmes instantly noted. Lestrade had already begun the interrogation, asking standard questions about Findlay's routine and relationships. Margaret's answers were quick and precise, but Holmes could see the subtle signs of tension that others might have missed. The slight twitch of her fingers as she clasped them together, the brief hesitation in her voice when asked about the victim's state of mind in the days leading up to his death. "Did Mr. Findlay seem concerned about anything recently?" Lestrade asked, leaning forward with interest. Margaret paused. A breath, just a fraction of a second too long. No, she said, her tone steady. Not at all. He was focused on his work, as usual. No signs of distress. Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. "And what of his recent dealings with Mr. Stroud?" he asked, watching closely for any change in her expression. Margaret's lips parted, but she quickly regained control of herself. "Mr. Stroud? I'm not sure what you mean. He sometimes mentioned things he was interested in, but nothing that stood out." Holmes's eyes narrowed. Her response was too controlled, too rehearsed. No personal mention of any particular artifact. Perhaps a dagger, perhaps. Margaret's gaze shifted ever so slightly. It was brief, but Holmes caught it. The slightest flicker of something darker. "I don't recall any specific mentions," she said, her voice faltering just slightly. "But then, I wasn't privy to all his business dealings." Holmes turned toward Lestrade, who was taking notes furiously. A curious omission, don't you think, Lestrade? She knew of the victim's interests but refuses to elaborate on the most recent one, an artifact he was so keen to acquire. Lestrade glanced up, clearly caught off guard. "You think she's hiding something?" Holmes merely nodded, his attention never leaving Margaret. "I do. The question is what? We'll need to look into her interactions with Finlay more closely. But for now, let's continue." Next, they spoke with Robert Evans, a business associate of Finlay's. He was a tall, sharp-dressed man, with a polished, almost too smooth demeanour. Evans had been with Finlay the day before his death, conducting business in his office. When asked about their meeting, Evans spoke with an ease that Holmes found unsettling. "We were discussing some investments," Evans said, his voice a perfect blend of confidence and calm. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Arthur seemed a bit distracted, but that was it." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Distracted in what way?" Evans shrugged, a practiced nonchalance that did nothing to ease the tension building in the room. "Just tired, I suppose. He'd been spending long hours at the office recently, nothing to worry about. He was always dedicated, you know." Holmes observed Evans with a keen eye, noting the way he quickly avoided eye contact when asked about specific details of their conversation. "Did he mention anything unusual in passing? Any recent acquisitions or concerns about his safety, perhaps?" Evans stiffened, his gaze flicking to the door before returning to Holmes with a tight smile. "Arthur never seemed worried about anything. As for acquisitions, I don't recall anything specific. He had his usual interests, but nothing out of the ordinary." Holmes felt a nagging sense of unease. Evans was being evasive, not necessarily by avoiding the questions, but by overloading his answers with too much detail, too much reassurance. It was as though he were trying to mask something, an undercurrent of truth buried beneath the layers of his words. Holmes, however, wasn't fooled. There was something deeper, something unsaid in Evans's smooth tone that didn't sit right. "See?" Holmes said slowly, the words deliberate. "I suppose we'll have to check your alibi then. You were with Mr. Finlay for several hours. Did anyone else witness your meeting?" Evans's gaze flickered again, just a hint of panic showing through. I assume the office staff can confirm, but beyond that, there's really no one else." Holmes nodded, knowing that this was only the beginning of uncovering the truth hidden beneath Evans's polished exterior. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Evans." Finally, they interviewed the most recent person to have seen Finlay alive. Edward Langdon, the man who had reportedly bought the dagger from Stroud. Langdon was a much younger man, well-spoken and eager to cooperate. His willingness to provide details was almost too eager, making Holmes wary. "Mr. Langdon, you were the last to see Mr. Finlay," Holmes began, watching Langdon's every movement as he responded. "Tell me about your meeting." Langdon smiled politely, his expression warm and open. "Oh, yes. I had a brief meeting with Mr. Finlay the day before his death. We discussed some antiques he was interested in, including a fine dagger I'd acquired from Stroud. But we didn't talk much beyond that. He wasn't feeling well, it seemed. A bit distant." Holmes pressed further. "And how did you come to possess the dagger, Mr. Langdon?" Langdon's smile faltered just for a second. "It was a private transaction. I bought it for my collection, of course. You know how these things go, Mr. Holmes." Holmes caught the slight hesitation in Langdon's voice, the way he tried to mask his discomfort with charm. There was something about the transaction that didn't quite add up, but Langdon's eagerness to cooperate was telling in itself. Perhaps he wanted to control the narrative. Holmes stood, motioning for Lestrade to take note. "It seems, Mr. Langdon, that you have all the answers. But answers sometimes are more elusive than they first appear." The contradictions were mounting, each witness and suspect providing pieces to the puzzle, but never quite fitting together. The inconsistencies in their stories, their reactions, their motives, all of it spoke of a deeper web of deception, one that was slowly, inevitably being unraveled. Holmes knew the threads were pulling tighter. All that was left was to follow them to their inevitable conclusion. As the evening wore on, Holmes found himself in his cluttered study, his mind swirling with the various contradictions he had uncovered. The investigation was progressing, but with each new piece of the puzzle, the picture only became more complex. It was as though every suspect had a reason to be involved, but no single theory could explain the full scope of the crime. Greed, jealousy, fear, each motive had its place, but none of them neatly fit the facts. Lestrade had left the station hours ago, leaving Holmes alone to sift through the details in the quiet of his own thoughts. The interplay between the suspects was like a tangled web, and each string of evidence pulled him in a different direction. But as Holmes reviewed the facts once more, he realized that the key to solving the mystery lay not in any one person's actions, but in the connections between them. Arthur Finlay's recent dealings were far more complex than they appeared at first glance. The dagger was central, of course. But it wasn't just any dagger. It was a piece of history, a coveted relic, and it had drawn the attention of several people. There was Stroud, the antiquities dealer, who had mentioned selling it to Langdon. But there was also Evans, who had seemed too eager to paint Finlay in a certain light, and Margaret Hale, the assistant whose forced calm was beginning to reveal a layer of deceit beneath the surface. Holmes knew he had to untangle the web. Each suspect had a reason, and yet none seemed to have a clear path to motive. The contradiction was maddening, and only by sifting through their alibis and connections would he begin to piece together the truth. The first clue, Holmes reasoned, lay in the timing of the murder. Finlay had been found dead late in the evening, hours after he'd met with Langdon to discuss the dagger. But Langdon had given no indication that he had been particularly close to Finlay. The transaction was brief, more of an acquaintances meeting than a business partnership, and yet Langdon had seemed too eager, almost desperate, to clear his name. Could it be that Langdon was lying about his involvement? Holmes considered this possibility carefully. But then there was Stroud, whose own behavior had been anything but casual. The man had known more about the dagger than he let on, and his reaction when questioned about the box had been telling. Was he trying to cover something up? And if so, what? Holmes suspected that Stroud's connection to Finlay went beyond mere business dealings. The antiquities dealer had something to hide, something related to the dagger. But Stroud's potential involvement wasn't the only complication. Margaret Hale's behavior had raised alarm bells as well. Her nervousness, the subtle signs of discomfort when asked about the victim's interests, had led Holmes to wonder whether she had been more involved in the affairs of her employer than she had admitted. Had she been hiding something from the start? Perhaps she'd seen something she shouldn't have, or maybe she had been trying to protect someone. Holmes's thoughts drifted back to the unusual detail from the investigation, the business card found in Finlay's pocket. Randolph Stroud's name had been the only thing written on it, yet the dagger had clearly played a pivotal role in Finlay's recent life. Holmes knew that the answer wasn't just about the transaction, it was about the relationships that connected all these players. The card had been an unexpected clue, and yet it had led Holmes to a crucial insight. Could it be that there was more to Finlay's relationships with Stroud and Langdon than first appeared? Had these men been caught up in something far more dangerous, something that had led to Finlay's untimely death? Holmes leaned back in his chair, pondering the various possibilities. A sudden knock at the door broke his reverie. Lestrade had returned. "Holmes, we've been able to confirm Langdon's alibi for the night of the murder," Lestrade said, stepping into the room with a pile of papers in his hand. "It checks out, but we've got something else." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Lestrade hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "Evans," he said finally, his voice low. "He's been hiding something. We've checked his financials, and it turns out he had a substantial debt, one that Finlay had been threatening to call in. It seems Finlay was pushing him hard to pay it back, and Evans was getting desperate." Holmes sat up straighter, his mind working swiftly. "So Evans had a motive after all?" Lestrade nodded. "It seems that way. But there's more. I've been digging into Stroud's background, and it turns out he was also in serious financial trouble. His shop was about to close, and the sale of the dagger to Langdon was his only way out. If it wasn't sold, Stroud would have lost everything. Could that have pushed him to murder?" Holmes rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Interesting. Stroud, it seems, wasn't the only one with everything to lose." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "You think Stroud killed Finlay to protect the sale?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "Not quite. Stroud may have had a reason to want Finlay gone, but I don't think he was the only one involved in the murder. And neither was Evans, though his debt is certainly a powerful motive. The web is tangled, Lestrade, and somewhere within it lies the truth." The next day, Holmes paid another visit to the police station where Lestrade had gathered the latest developments. The investigation had reached a crossroads, with each lead growing more convoluted. Holmes was beginning to suspect that the truth was not just hidden in the motives, but in the actions and in the relationships between the suspects. It was time to turn his attention to the alibis. Holmes had already deduced that Evans's alibi was less than airtight, and he suspected Stroud's story about his whereabouts the night of the murder was fabricated. But Margaret Hale, her role was still unclear. Holmes needed to understand her connection to the others, to know if she was hiding something that could expose the true culprit. Holmes's mind raced through the connections, each piece of the puzzle now falling into place. The dagger, The debts, the lies, all of it led to one conclusion. Finlay had known far more than he had let on, and someone had been desperate enough to silence him. But who and why? Holmes felt the stirrings of a revelation, but the final piece eluded him. He knew he wasn't far from uncovering the full story. He could almost feel the answers on the tip of his tongue. The web of motives was tightening around them all, and soon he would have them cornered. But until then, he had to keep pulling at the threads, patiently unraveling the lies that had led them here. Every answer brought them closer to the truth, closer to the one who had killed Arthur Finlay. The investigation had reached what seemed to be an impasse, with each suspect seemingly cornered by their own lies, but no concrete evidence to bring the case to a close. The mounting tension was beginning to weigh on everyone involved, and yet the truth still evaded them all. Holmes had continued his quiet work, combing through the evidence with a diligence that was slowly starting to pay off. It wasn't long before something small but significant caught his eye. It was a slip of paper tucked between the pages of one of Finlay's ledgers, nearly invisible amidst the old business transactions. The paper was smudged, faintly, stained with ink, but the name scrawled on it was clear enough. Langdon. Holmes stared at it for a long moment, running through the implications in his mind. Langdon's involvement had always felt too convenient, too rehearsed, but this changed things. The slip of paper indicated a secretive meeting between Finlay and Langdon just a few days before the murder, one that hadn't been mentioned in any of Langdon's statements. The implications were profound. If Langdon had been hiding something as simple as a meeting, what else was he concealing? Lestrade, eager for a breakthrough, wasted no time. "Holmes, what do you make of this?" he asked, his eyes flicking between the paper and the detective, his tone carrying a thread of hope. "It's a lead, Lestrade," Holmes replied, his voice steady but measured. "A rather significant one. We'll need to pay Langdon a visit." Within the hour, they were standing outside Langdon's townhouse, a pristine Victorian structure nestled in one of the wealthier parts of London. The address on the paper matched perfectly with Langdon's residence, and Holmes couldn't help but feel a spark of certainty. Perhaps this was it, the break they'd been waiting for. Langdon greeted them with a practiced smile, though Holmes couldn't ignore the flicker of unease in his eyes. His usual smooth charm was gone, replaced by a defensive tension that was impossible to miss. "Mr. Langdon, we need to ask you about a recent meeting with Arthur Finlay," Holmes began, keeping his voice calm but authoritative. "It seems there was an arrangement that you didn't disclose during our earlier conversation." Langdon's face remained an unreadable mask for a moment, before a slight furrow appeared between his brows. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. Holmes didn't flinch. "A meeting, just days before Finlay's death. There's a record of it, Mr. Langdon. What exactly did you and Mr. Finlay discuss?" For a moment Langdon hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the door, as though contemplating a way out. Then, with a forced exhale, he lowered his gaze. "All right, fine. Yes, we did meet," he admitted, his voice a touch strained. "But it was a private matter, personal. Nothing to do with the dagger or any business deals." Holmes pressed further. What was the private matter, and why was it kept a secret from the rest of the investigation? Langdon seemed to stiffen, his facade of calm cracking. Look, it wasn't important. Just a misunderstanding, a bit of a disagreement. We sorted it out. It wasn't worth mentioning. Holmes's eyes never left Langdon's face. The nervous twitch of his hand, the rapid blinking. He was lying. A disagreement? About what, exactly? He asked, each word carefully chosen, the weight of his interrogation growing heavier. Langdon swallowed, his jaw tightening. I owed him money, he confessed finally. His words hurried, as though he were trying to push them out before he lost his nerve. Finley had invested in a project of mine, and I couldn't pay him back. He was angry. He wanted more time, but I couldn't give it to him, that's all. It's nothing criminal. Holmes observed Langdon closely, his mind working quickly. A debt. It wasn't the first time the issue of money had come up in relation to Finley, but now there was a new detail. Langdon had been in deeper than he had initially let on. The business dealings, the pressure to repay, all pointed to a motive. Still, something about the story didn't quite add up. Lestrade, for his part, was already preparing to take Langdon into custody, eager to declare the case solved. "You hear that, Holmes?" he said, his voice full of triumph. "We've got the motive, we've got the confession. This is it." Holmes's gaze was unwavering as he studied Langdon. The evidence was compelling, certainly, but it didn't sit right with him. He had seen too many cases where the most obvious solution was the wrong one. This confession, this moment of clarity, it felt too convenient, too neatly packaged, and he wasn't one to rush to conclusions. "Lestrade, hold on," Holmes said, his voice firm as he motioned for the inspector to stop. "This isn't over yet." Lestrade's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, Holmes? We have him. He confessed." Holmes shook his head, his eyes narrowing as he processed the implications. "A debt alone doesn't explain the murder, Lestrade. This isn't just a crime of financial desperation. Langdon's story doesn't explain everything, and there's more to this than he's admitting." Langdon's face paled at Holmes's words, and for the first time the mask slipped entirely. "What do you mean? I've told you everything," he stammered, his voice rising. Holmes stepped closer, his tone calm but with a cutting edge. "The question is why you're so eager to confess. Your debt to Finley was real, yes, but I believe there's more here than a simple transaction gone wrong. There's something you're not telling us, and I intend to find out what it is." Langdon swallowed hard, clearly rattled by Holmes's words. The confession that had seemed so solid now appeared more like a smokescreen, something hastily constructed to end the investigation before it could go any further. Holmes turned to Lestrade, his mind already racing ahead. "Langdon is hiding something, Lestrade, and I'm afraid the real culprit is still out there. We've been led down a path, but it's not the right one." "Not yet." Lestrade's face fell, his earlier triumph fading into confusion. But what now?" Holmes smiled, though it was tinged with a grim satisfaction. "Now, we look closer, much closer. We have a confession, but not the truth. And as always, the truth is the most elusive prize of all." With Langdon now under suspicion, Lestrade reluctantly agreed to hold off on any formal charges. But Holmes was certain they were, on the edge of uncovering something much darker than a simple financial dispute. The true criminal, the one who had orchestrated the death of Arthur Finley, remained in the shadows, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. As Holmes left Langdon's townhouse, he felt the heavy weight of the investigation pressing down on him. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Holmes sat in his study, the weight of the day's events settling over him like a thick fog. Langdon's confession, though shaky and incomplete, had momentarily seemed like a victory. But as Holmes replayed the conversation in his mind, a gnawing feeling of uncertainty lingered. Something about Langdon's eagerness to confess didn't sit right. The more Holmes thought about it, the more he was convinced that they had stumbled upon only part of the picture. There were connections, forgotten details, and half-formed memories that kept circling in his mind like ghosts refusing to be exorcised. He had retreated into his study to consider the next move. But the more he sifted through the details, the more a particular thought resurfaced. The strange sensation that the present crime was somehow tied to the past. A case he had solved years ago, one that hadn't seemed important at the time, suddenly seemed linked to this very situation. But how and why? A small, nondescript book on his desk caught his eye. It was a ledger from a previous case, a theft involving a different antique dealer, one of many that Holmes had handled. He had taken this particular ledger out of habit, thinking it might help with a different matter entirely. As his fingers flipped through the yellowed pages, a name stood out. Randolph Stroud. The very same name that had appeared on the business card found in Finley's pocket. Holmes's mind raced. The memory clicked into place. He remembered Stroud from years ago. At the time, the man had been implicated in a series of shady transactions involving a rare collection of historical artifacts. Stroud had been a small-time player then, but his connection to larger, more dangerous networks had never been fully investigated. It had been one of those cases where the clues didn't line up, where the suspects had scattered into the shadows too quickly. But now, as Holmes stared at the ledger, he realized that Stroud had been a much more significant figure than he had first realized. It wasn't just Stroud's name that stood out. No, it was the connection between him and another name in the ledger, Finley, Arthur Finley. The two had been involved in a transaction years ago, one that had gone sour and had been covered up by a web of lies. Holmes hadn't thought much of it back then, dismissing it as an old grudge between businessmen. But now, looking back, he could see the hints of something darker, something more insidious that linked Finley's past to Stroud's current desperation. Holmes stood abruptly, his mind whirling. This case was no longer just about a murder. It was about a much older set of grievances, and someone was still trying to cover them up. Lestrade had only just settled in his office when Holmes arrived, the air of purpose around him unmistakable. He wasted no time with pleasantries. "Lestrade, I need you to pull the records for an old case from 5 years ago. It involves Randolph Stroud and Arthur Finley. It may seem like an afterthought, but trust me, it's vital." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "Stroud? Finley? That's a bit of a stretch, Holmes. What's this about?" "Please, just trust me," Holmes replied, his voice low and urgent. "The answers to the present lie buried in the past. Stroud's connection to Finley is more than just a coincidence, and I believe it's the key to everything." It took several hours for Lestrade to gather the old files. When they finally arrived, Holmes pored over them with the same intensity that he had applied to the present investigation. As he sifted through the yellowed pages, an eerie sense of familiarity washed over him. It was as if he had known all along that these records held the answers he was now seeking. The case involved a theft, a series of rare artifacts that had been stolen from a collection. Among the stolen items was a ceremonial dagger, a golden dagger, crafted with intricate designs that had been linked to a shadowy criminal organisation operating out of London's black market. At the time, Stroud had been accused of facilitating the sale of these artifacts, but there had been no solid proof. Finlay, it turned out, had been a middleman, a dealer who had provided Stroud with access to a collection of rare items, including that very Golden Dagger. Holmes's pulse quickened. This was the same dagger, the one that had been found at the crime scene. The connection was clearer now than ever. The events of the past weren't just echoing through the present. They were driving it. Stroud had been involved in a far more significant operation than anyone had realized, and Finlay had been an unwitting player in a much larger game. Finlay had, of course, walked away from the situation years ago, severing ties with Stroud and the shady dealings. But what if he hadn't truly escaped? What if the ghosts of the past had come back to haunt him? Holmes could see it now. Stroud, desperate to reclaim his place in the underworld, had sought Finlay out again, maybe to recover the dagger, maybe to settle old scores, but that was only part of the story. If Stroud was the trigger, then someone else had been pulling the strings all along, someone who had quietly remained in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Lestrade's arrival interrupted Holmes's train of thought. "Holmes, I've got something," Lestrade said, holding up a letter that had just arrived at the station. "It's from an anonymous informant. The writer claims to know who killed Finlay." Holmes frowned, his mind racing. "And what does the letter say?" Lestrade's voice dropped, as though unsure of what he had read. "It's cryptic, but it mentions a deal between Finlay and a woman named Margaret Hale. It suggests that she knew more about Finlay's past dealings than she let on, and that she may have been the one to deliver the dagger to Stroud." Holmes's brow furrowed. Margaret Hale? The assistant? He had suspected her behavior, but this new information changed things. If she was connected to Finlay's past, then perhaps she wasn't just a bystander in this crime. Perhaps she had been instrumental in setting the entire scheme in motion. "Get her here, Lestrade," Holmes ordered, his voice sharp, "and keep an eye on Stroud. I believe this has all been part of a much older plan, and now that the past has caught. Up to the present, the final act is about to unfold." As the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, Holmes knew that he was getting closer to the heart of the mystery. The shadows of the past loomed large over the investigation, but now they were finally coming into focus. The connections between the suspects were no longer just theoretical. They were a reality, one that tied each of them to Finlay's death in ways no one had imagined. Holmes couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The truth was within his grasp, but the real questions, the ones that would tie everything together, were still waiting in the wings. The final curtain had yet to rise. The air in the room was thick with anticipation as Holmes leaned back in, his chair contemplating the delicate web of lies, half-truths, and motivations he was slowly unraveling. The connection to the past was clear now. Arthur Finlay's tangled dealings, Randolph Stroud's desperate involvement, and the mysterious woman, Margaret Hale. Each piece fit into the puzzle, but there was still something elusive, something unspoken that lingered at the edges of the case, a crucial detail that remained hidden in plain sight. Holmes had spent the better part of the evening thinking over the informant's letter, which had pointed toward Margaret Hale. It was a compelling lead, but it was still just that, one lead among many. The more he examined it, the more he realized the only way to get to the truth was to test the suspect's resolve. to see how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. And he knew exactly how to do that. It wasn't enough to interrogate Margaret directly. She was too well practiced, too clever. What he needed was a way to break through her carefully constructed facade without her even realizing it. A method as unconventional as it was effective. Holmes glanced up at Lestrade, who had been watching him closely, his brow furrowed. "Lestrade, I need you to arrange for a small experiment. We'll need to bring Margaret Hale to the station tomorrow, but we'll do it in such a way that she won't know we're testing her just yet. I want to see how she reacts to something rather unexpected." Lestrade looked puzzled. "What exactly are you planning, Holmes?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the streets of London, where shadows crept across the cobblestone like ancient secrets, waiting to be uncovered. "I'm going to give her a reason to believe she's being cornered. The pressure will tell us everything we need to know." The following afternoon, Margaret Hale was brought into the station under the pretense of being questioned about her relationship with Arthur Finlay. She entered the room with an air of confidence, her steps measured and deliberate. Her cool composure seemed almost too perfect, as though she were fully aware of the scrutiny she was under. She sat down without hesitation, her back straight, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of weakness. Holmes, however, was not one to show his hand easily. As Margaret took a seat, he stepped forward with his usual quiet grace and began to speak with a casual tone, as though he were merely making polite conversation. "Miss Hale," he began, his voice carrying that familiar, almost casual edge that always seemed to put his suspects on edge. "I must admit, I find it curious that you've kept such a low profile in all this. One would think that someone in your position would be eager to clear their name after such a public scandal." Margaret's gaze flickered for just a moment, an imperceptible twitch of her brow. Holmes caught it, his sharp eyes missing nothing. She recovered quickly, however, her face smoothing back into an expression of polite indifference. "I've said all I need to say, Mr. Holmes. My connection to Mr. Finlay was strictly professional. As I've told the inspector, I had no reason to be involved in his death." Holmes nodded, as though accepting her answer at face value, but inside he was calculating. There was something about her tone, too measured, too rehearsed, that set his instincts on high alert. And he knew that in these kinds of situations, the best way to uncover the truth was to put his suspects in a position where they believed they could control the conversation. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And yet, Miss Hale, I must ask you again about the dagger. The Golden Dagger, the one that was found with Mr. Finlay's body. We know it was part of a transaction between you and Mr. Stroud. But why would you involve yourself in something so dangerous, so, well, illicit? Surely you knew the consequences." The mention of the dagger was like a spark that ignited a slight change in Margaret's demeanour. Her lips parted ever so briefly, and her eyes darted to the table before she quickly regained her composure. Holmes noted the fleeting moment of vulnerability, but he didn't give her time to recover. "Perhaps it's true that I've been involved in certain dealings in the past," she said, her voice lowering. "But I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I am not the one you should be questioning about the dagger's significance. That's all in the past. It was a simple exchange between two men who have long since gone their separate ways." Holmes smiled faintly, knowing she was already slipping. "But you see, Miss Hale, the past is never truly separate from the present, is it? Especially when It involves someone like Stroud, who has always had a knack for getting what he wants. And now here you are, involved in his web of deceit. Tell me, what exactly did you hope to gain from all of this? What was your real role in all of this? Margaret's lips pressed together tightly, and for the first time she seemed to hesitate. The smooth veneer she had been wearing cracked just enough for Holmes to see the inner tension beneath. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but Holmes had honed the art of reading people like a book. Lestrade, who had been watching the interrogation from behind the one-way glass, began to fidget nervously. Holmes kept his gaze steady on Margaret, never once allowing her to see that the game had shifted. Suddenly, Holmes dropped the facade. I believe you're hiding something, Miss Hale. Something more than just your involvement with Mr. Stroud. You see, I've been thinking about your behavior, your answers, and I've come to a rather interesting conclusion. Margaret's breath caught, and for the first time she looked genuinely nervous. Her fingers twitched at her sides, betraying her calm demeanor. Holmes took a step closer, watching her closely. He had her now. You've been very careful with your words, but you've also been avoiding one crucial detail. The motive behind Mr. Finley's death, he continued, his voice steady and laced with a calculated confidence. I think you've been playing a game, Miss Hale, a game where the stakes are much higher than you've let on, and I think you've underestimated me. For a moment, Margaret's eyes widened, and then, just as quickly, she composed herself. But it was too late. Holmes had broken through her carefully constructed defenses. The crack in her story was there, and she knew it. How did you know? She whispered, the words barely escaping her lips, as if she were confessing to a truth that had long been buried. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he allowed the weight of the moment to settle in the air. The subtle psychological trick had worked. Margaret had cracked under the pressure, revealing a sliver of truth she hadn't intended to expose. Now, Miss Hale, Holmes said softly, the real question is, how far will you go to protect your secrets? Margaret's eyes flickered to the door, then back at Holmes. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself, and that was when Holmes knew he had her. Margaret Hale's confession, though small and tentative, had been the breakthrough Holmes needed. He knew now that the web of lies surrounding the Golden Dagger and the death of Arthur Finley was far more intricate than anyone had suspected. There was more to Margaret's involvement, something deeper, more dangerous, and far-reaching than a simple deal gone wrong. But just as the case began to gain momentum, as the fog of confusion slowly lifted, the ground beneath Holmes's feet shifted once more. The call came just after midnight, when the streets of London were wrapped in their usual cloak of quiet unease. Lestrade's voice, usually firm and authoritative, trembled slightly over the phone. Holmes, it's gone. The ledger, the Golden Dagger, everything's gone. Holmes's pulse quickened. Gone? He repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. Yes. The vault was broken into earlier tonight. The evidence is missing. We've checked the entire station. No sign of forced entry. No signs of anything unusual. But everything important, everything we've been working towards, is gone. Holmes stood, his mind already racing. He knew this was no accident. Someone was playing a far deeper game, someone who had not only been observing, but had been preparing for this very moment. He didn't wait for another word. Meet me at the station immediately. When Holmes arrived at the station, the air was thick with tension. Lestrade stood by the vault, his face pale under the flickering gaslight. There's no sign of the thief, no fingerprints, no evidence of a struggle. It's as if the thief had known exactly where to look. Holmes walked toward the vault, his fingers grazing the metal door as he examined it. The lock was intact, the mechanisms undisturbed. Whoever had taken the evidence had done so with alarming precision without causing a trace. It was the perfect crime, a calculated move meant to erase any trace of the truth. "Who knew the combination to the vault?" Holmes asked, his voice low and tense. Lestrade hesitated. "Only a few of us, but most of the officers are trustworthy. We've worked together for years, Holmes." "We couldn't have—" Holmes held up a hand, cutting him off. "There's no time for sentiment, Lestrade. Someone here is working against us." Lestrade's face grew darker. "You think it's someone within the station?" Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the room, noting every detail. A misplaced file, an overturned chair, small things easily overlooked. But something about the scene was off. It wasn't just the missing evidence that bothered him. It was the way the room had been left, as though the thief wanted to make a point, to ensure that their actions were noticed. "There's a clue here," Holmes murmured, his eyes narrowing as they swept across the room. "Whoever took the evidence wanted us to know it had been taken, wanted to watch us scramble." Lestrade's expression darkened. "And now we're back at square one." Holmes paused, considering the implications. If someone within the station had orchestrated this theft, they were likely trying to sabotage the investigation and prevent the truth from surfacing. The stakes had just been raised, and the detective realized, more than ever, that trust was a fragile thing in this game. The next few days passed in a blur of frustration. The investigation into the theft went nowhere. Despite all their efforts, there was no trace of the missing evidence, no sign of who was behind the crime. Holmes found himself more and more distracted, his mind constantly shifting between the known facts and the mystery that had now taken an even darker turn. Lestrade had called in additional officers to comb through the station, hoping to find some overlooked detail that might lead them to the culprit. But Holmes wasn't convinced that the solution lay within the station at all. Whoever had taken the evidence had done so with a level of sophistication that suggested careful planning, not a rash decision. Holmes spent hours examining the ledger, again, despite the fact that it was no longer in the station's possession. He could practically see the words on the page, the entries about the transaction, the name of Margaret Hale, the Golden Dagger that had been passed through the black market. There was something more to this ledger, something that the thief had not accounted for, something that could unravel everything if it was found again. It was then that Holmes remembered the hidden compartment in the ledger. It had been easy to overlook, even for him. But now that the evidence was gone, it was the only lead left to follow. He made his way to the library, where the old records were kept. The room was silent, save for the soft rustling of paper as Holmes carefully examined each ledger in turn. His fingers brushed over the cracked covers of ancient volumes, each one a testament to forgotten crimes and vanished mysteries. As he reached the final shelf, his hand froze. There, tucked between two larger volumes, was a single, inconspicuous ledger. The cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age. But it was the date written on the first page that caught his attention. 5 years ago, the year of the initial theft. Holmes's heart quickened as he flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. There it was, in the margins of the transaction records. An additional note. He paused, his breath held as he read the words. The dagger is still in play. Trust no one. Not even him. It was cryptic, but the message was clear. The dagger, the one that had been stolen from the station, had never truly disappeared. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting to be claimed. And the person who had taken it was trying to cover their tracks. Someone who wanted to make sure that no one else could uncover the truth. Holmes closed the ledger, his mind racing. Whoever had orchestrated this theft was far more dangerous than he had initially realized. This wasn't just about one crime. It was about an intricate network of deceit that reached deeper than even Holmes had imagined. And now, with the evidence gone, the only thing left to do was to follow the trail, wherever it led, no matter where that path might take him. The clock was ticking, and Holmes could feel the walls closing in. But one thing was certain. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous the game became. The stolen evidence was not just an obstacle. It was a challenge. Whoever was behind this theft wanted to bury the truth, but Holmes knew better than to believe that the trail had gone cold. The game was far from over. The tension in the air was palpable as Holmes walked through the quiet streets of London, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. He had been so close to uncovering the truth. The missing ledger, the cryptic note, the stolen dagger. Yet every time he felt he was one step ahead, the ground seemed to shift beneath him, leaving him once again in the dark. He could not shake the feeling that the criminal or criminals were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The pressure was mounting, and Holmes knew that time was running out. The sudden ringing of his pocket watch broke his thoughts. A note. It was from Lestrade, brief and to the point. Holmes, come quickly. Another murder. Same manner. Same victim. Holmes's pulse quickened. Another murder. He had known it was only a matter of time. This wasn't just a robbery or an act of vengeance. It was something more calculated, more sinister. The killer was still out there, and now they were one step closer to finishing what they had started. The journey to the crime scene was swift, though the grim news weighed heavily on him. By the time he arrived at the address, the familiar silhouette of Inspector Lestrade was already visible, standing among a cluster of officers outside a row house. Holmes approached with purpose, his keen eyes scanning the scene for any sign of disturbance. Lestrade met him with a grim expression. It's just like the first murder, Holmes. Same method, same victim profile, the woman Margaret Hale. She was found not far from here, in the same state as Finlay, strangled, no sign of a struggle. Whoever's behind this is getting bolder. Holmes's gaze moved over the scene, noting the lack of visible evidence. The body lay there, eerily untouched, as though the killer had left in a hurry. There were no witnesses, no disturbances, and nothing that could indicate a motive. But Holmes knew better. This wasn't just another killing. This was part of a larger plan. Who found the body? Holmes asked, his voice steady. A neighbor, Lestrade replied. She heard a scream, came out to investigate. By the time she reached the alley, it was already too late, but she did mention something odd. There was a strange sound, like a faint clicking, just before the scream. Holmes frowned, his mind working through the details. A clicking sound. Was it mechanical? Or perhaps a sound of something deliberate? Lestrade nodded. She wasn't sure, but she was adamant about it. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That's worth investigating. But right now, I need to focus on something more pressing. The killer is no fool. He knows we're closing in, and now he's taking precautions. He's not just trying to kill people. He's trying to send us a message that we're still not getting. Lestrade seemed to take a step back, processing the significance of what Holmes was saying. So you think the victim's death is a message? Yes, but a message about what exactly? Holmes muttered under his breath, his mind already shifting gears. The first murder was calculated, and Margaret Hale was involved with the same circle. This isn't random. The killer is getting closer to the center of the mystery. Later that evening, Holmes returned to his office, the case weighing heavily on his thoughts. He could no longer afford to follow the usual suspects. The pattern was no longer clear. Everything was shifting faster than he could track. But there was one thing he knew for certain. The killer had not been acting alone. There were too many small clues pointing toward a larger network. And it wasn't just the police they were trying to deceive. Holmes had no doubt that someone was toying with him. As he reviewed his notes, his hand paused over the list of names: Margaret Hale, Arthur Finlay, Randolph Stroud, and even the officers involved in the investigation. But none of them seemed to fit the full profile of the murderer. The clicking sound, the way the bodies had been positioned, everything pointed to someone orchestrating these deaths with methodical precision. And the fact that Margaret Hale had been killed so soon after revealing a hint of her own involvement meant that whoever was pulling the strings wasn't just acting on impulse. This was a man, or woman, who had long ago calculated every move. Holmes's thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Lestrade entered quickly, his face pale and anxious. "Holmes, you need to come quickly. The constables just found something you'll want to see." Without a word, Holmes grabbed his coat and followed Lestrade down the stairs, his mind racing. Another clue? Or another tragedy? The scene they arrived at was even more unnerving than the previous night's murder. This time, it wasn't just a body, it was a warning. The victim, an officer from the station, lay lifeless on the ground in front of a building, his body contorted in an unnatural way. A note had been left beside him, written in ink that looked like it had been hastily applied. Holmes approached the body, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. The officer's uniform was still intact, but his eyes had been gouged out, a grotesque detail that seemed almost ritualistic. The note read, "You're too late. The pieces are already in motion." Lestrade recoiled. "What does it mean, Holmes? What's going on?" Holmes crouched next to the body, his eyes scanning. "Every detail. It means that we've underestimated the true nature of this game. The killer is not just targeting those who are involved in the investigation. He's sending us a message, a challenge." Lestrade looked over at Holmes, a hint of doubt in his expression. "But why the officer? Why attack one of your own?" Holmes stood, his gaze unwavering. "Because the killer knows we're getting too close. He's not just trying to stop us. He's trying to manipulate us. He wants us to make a mistake. The officer's death wasn't just a murder. It was an escalation. A sign that whoever was behind the killings was ready to go to extreme lengths to make sure their secrets stayed buried." Holmes now faced a new challenge, preventing another death before it could happen. The killer had shown his hand, and Holmes realized that he wasn't just solving a crime. He was racing against time to stop a far greater disaster from unfolding. As Holmes and Lestrade made their way back to the station, Holmes felt the weight of the case pressing down on him harder than ever before. Whoever was behind this, they were still several steps ahead. and the clock was ticking. The days that followed the officer's gruesome murder only deepened the haze of confusion that hung over the case. Holmes found himself growing more frustrated, with each passing moment unable to make the connections he so desperately needed to crack the case wide open. Each new development only seemed to raise more questions, and with each step, the killer appeared to be one move ahead, leaving Holmes to chase shadows. Still, as always, there was a method to the madness. Holmes's mind, though fatigued, never wavered in its pursuit of clarity. He continued to examine the details with painstaking care, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. In these quiet moments of observation, the answer always lay hidden, just beneath the surface. It was while reviewing the latest set of witness statements that something caught his attention, an offhand comment from one of the officers who had arrived at the scene the night Margaret Hale had been murdered. Holmes had read the statement multiple times, but it hadn't been until this second reading that the subtle detail hit him like a bolt of lightning. The officer, a constable named William Gray, had mentioned something peculiar during his interview. "I noticed a woman walking past the alleyway that night right before the scream. She seemed distracted, kept glancing at a pocket watch, and then hurried away as if she was late for something." It was such a minor detail in the officer's testimony that it almost seemed irrelevant. And yet, it was that very detail, an unfamiliar woman, a pocket watch, and the urgency of her movements, that began to piece the puzzle together in Holmes's mind. A pocket watch, a small, seemingly insignificant object, yet it had cropped up in the case on more than one occasion. Finley's watch had been found at the scene of his murder, a subtle yet telling clue that had been dismissed by the authorities as an afterthought. Margaret Hale had also been known to wear a pocket watch, and now this woman with the same strange urgency and a similar watch. Holmes couldn't ignore the strange symmetry of it all. He rose abruptly, the fog of confusion clearing as a new realization took hold. He turned to Lestrade, who had been pacing the room, his own frustration palpable. "Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice sharp, "I believe we've been looking at this all wrong. This case is not about isolated murders, it's about a specific set of people, a group with more in common than we realized." Lestrade raised an eyebrow, a skeptical expression crossing his face. "What do you mean?" Holmes walked to the table, where he had laid out the various notes and evidence that had been gathered over the past few days. He began to sift through the papers, his fingers brushing over each clue as if they were pieces of a larger puzzle. The victims, all of them, share connections that go beyond mere proximity. Margaret Hale, Arthur Finley, and even Constable Gray, they're all tied to a single event, an incident that took place years ago, one that none of them speak about. Lestrade frowned. "You think there's a deeper connection?" "Yes," Holmes replied, his voice becoming more urgent with each passing moment. "I suspect that our killer is part of a group of individuals involved in a forgotten crime. A crime that happened long before these murders, but one that has left an indelible mark on each of them. A secret, buried for years, is now coming to light, and the killer is silencing anyone who might expose it." Lestrade's expression darkened as he processed Holmes's theory. "And the pocket watch? What's its significance?" Holmes paused, for a moment, eyes narrowing in thought. "The pocket watch is the key. It is no coincidence that it has appeared at each crime scene. Someone in this group is using it as a marker, a signal to remind the others of the past, to remind them that they are still bound to that secret." Lestrade stared at him, a mix of disbelief and hope in his eyes. But why kill these people? Now, after all these years? Holmes's gaze turned cold as he considered the question. Because the time has come. Someone, whether from guilt, fear, or a desire for revenge, has decided it's time to take control of the narrative. They've been waiting for the perfect moment, and now they're trying to erase any trace of the truth. Lestrade was quiet for a long moment, digesting Holmes's words. Then, with a decisive nod, he said, "Where do we start?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with resolve. "We start with the one detail that has eluded us until now, the group. We need to find out who else was involved in the original crime. Once we identify the members of this circle, we can begin to unravel the motivations behind the murders." Holmes turned toward his desk, pulling out a series of old case files he had been studying for the past few days. He had already begun tracing the connections between the victims. But now, with this new understanding of the case, everything started to fit together. It wasn't just a random series of murders. It was a chain of events set in motion by something far deeper. A betrayal, a shared secret, something that had been buried for far too long. Holmes's thoughts raced as he sifted through the files, matching names to dates, to places, to forgotten connections. Then, just as the pieces were beginning to align, his finger paused over a familiar name. Randolph Stroud. The name had come up time and again. An influential businessman with a murky past, a man whose connections to the victims were tenuous at best, but who now seemed to be at the center of it all. Holmes's mind clicked into place. Stroud had been involved in the original crime. There was no doubt about it. The pocket watch had to be his, a personal item passed down to the members of his inner circle, a reminder of their shared past. Stroud had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating the people around him to keep his secrets buried. Holmes stood up suddenly, a sense of clarity washing over him. "Lestrade, we need to move quickly. Stroud is the key. He has the answers we've been searching for, and he's not going to wait for us to find him." Lestrade looked up, his face set with determination. "I'll round up the men. Let's bring him in." As they rushed out of the room, Holmes could feel the momentum building. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the endgame had begun. But the danger was far from over. Whoever was behind these killings was still out there, waiting, plotting their next move. The final confrontation was drawing nearer, and Holmes knew that nothing could prepare him for what was about to come. As the team moved swiftly through the city streets, the weight of the truth began to sink in. Holmes's mind raced, unraveling, the last of the tangled threads that had held this case together for so long. The pieces were all in place now, and there was no turning back. Lestrade, along with his officers, had gathered outside Randolph Stroud's grand estate. It was a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of London, one that had long been a symbol of Stroud's wealth and influence. Holmes stood in the center of the yard, his gaze fixed on the dark windows, knowing that inside those walls lay the answer they sought. Lestrade approached him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Holmes, you seem certain of this. What exactly do you think we'll find in there?" Holmes took a long, measured breath. "A confession, Lestrade. Not in words, but in actions. Stroud has been playing a game far too long, and he believes the end justifies the means. He thinks he's untouchable." Lestrade's confusion deepened, but before he could speak again, Holmes motioned for the team to move forward. They proceeded with the kind of quiet precision that had marked all their earlier work, nothing out of the ordinary, no hasty moves. Holmes felt an unease settle deep within him. The closer they got to Stroud, the more palpable the danger became. He knew that when the truth was exposed, it would shock them all. Inside Stroud's estate, the air was thick with a false sense of luxury and comfort. Everything about the house screamed opulence, from the polished floors to the expensive paintings on the walls. But Holmes's sharp eye didn't miss the small signs of a mind at war. Half-empty glasses left on tables, papers scattered across desks, an oppressive stillness in the air that suggested the calm before a storm. As they entered the main hallway, Holmes motioned for the officers to spread out, ensuring every exit was covered. They moved as one, methodical in their search, but there was a distinct tension in the air, as if everyone knew that once they cornered Stroud, it would all come to an end. It was in Stroud's private study that Holmes found the key, the final detail that had eluded him up until now. The room, unlike the rest of the mansion, was dimly lit, with shadows clinging to the edges. Holmes walked over to Stroud's desk, his gaze immediately falling on a small, inconspicuous drawer that had been left slightly ajar. With the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what to look for, he opened it. Inside, wrapped in a velvet cloth, was a set of letters, ancient, yellowed, and meticulously preserved. Holmes unfolded them carefully one by one. They were personal letters written in an almost archaic script. The contents spoke of an agreement, a pact made long ago, one sealed with blood. A promise that had been broken by one of the group's original members, a betrayal that had never been forgiven. Holmes's eyes darkened as he read the letters aloud, his voice carrying the weight of the past. This is it. Stroud was part of something far bigger than we could have imagined, something that no one could have predicted. A pact made decades ago, among a group of men who swore to protect a secret at all costs. Lestrade, who had been standing just behind Holmes, felt a chill run down his spine. A pact, he repeated, his voice shaking. But what's the connection to the murders? Holmes turned slowly to face him, his expression grim. The pact was not about money, nor power, nor revenge. It was about something far deeper, a secret buried in the past, something so damning that those involved would do anything to ensure it stayed hidden. Lestrade's brow furrowed in confusion. What could be so important? Holmes's gaze locked onto Lestrade's, and for the first time a flicker of understanding passed between them. A crime. A crime that destroyed the life of an innocent person. A crime so horrific that its very memory was enough to drive these men to the edge of madness. And they have kept it buried for years, silencing anyone who might come too close to the truth. Lestrade's voice grew quiet. So Stroud. He was protecting something much darker than we ever knew. Holmes nodded. Yes. The killings weren't about money or power or even revenge. They were about survival. Stroud and the others involved had buried the truth so deep that it threatened to destroy everything they had worked for. Every murder, every twist, was not an act of malice, but an act of desperation, a desperate attempt to keep a secret that could shatter their lives. As Holmes spoke, the room seemed to close in around him, the weight of the revelation pressing down on his shoulders. The crimes that had seemed so unrelated, so disconnected, now made sense in a way he hadn't anticipated. The motive was not just about any of the usual triggers: greed, jealousy, anger. It was about fear of exposure, of being undone by a mistake made so long ago that its very existence was more dangerous than the lives of those who tried to protect it. Stroud, as Holmes had suspected, had been the orchestrator, the one holding everything together. But it wasn't just Stroud who had been involved. There were others, people close to him, who had also lived under the shadow of this crime. Each one of them had been complicit, bound by a dark history that none of them could escape. Holmes turned sharply, moving to a second set of papers that had been left unattended on the desk. His fingers traced over the familiar handwriting, and as he read the final letter aloud, the final puzzle piece fell into place. "This letter," Holmes began, "was written by the original victim, a woman caught in the middle of a terrible crime. She knew the truth, and it seems she was preparing to expose it, until she was silenced." Lestrade's heart raced. Who was she? Holmes looked up, his eyes narrowed in a rare moment of reflection. Her name was Elizabeth Stroud, Randolph Stroud's sister. She discovered the crime and threatened to expose it. But they couldn't afford to let her live, not when the past was so close to unraveling, so they killed her. The full weight of the conspiracy sank in, and the shock was undeniable. Stroud had not only been trying to protect himself, but he had also been trying to erase any evidence of his sister's existence, his own blood, silenced by the same fear that had driven the others to commit murder. The deeper motive behind it all was far darker than anyone could have guessed. It wasn't just about self-preservation. It was about the complete destruction of a past that threatened to bring down everything Stroud had built. The mansion had fallen deathly quiet. The only sound the faint rustling of papers in the wind that blew through the open windows. Holmes stood in the center of the room, the weight of everything he had uncovered pressing heavily on him. His thoughts churned, each detail coming together like pieces of a long sought-after puzzle. Randolph Stroud had nowhere left to hide, but Holmes was keenly aware that the final confrontation was fast approaching. Lestrade lingered by the door, an air of uncertainty hanging over him. "Holmes, do you think he knows we're onto him?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the desk where Stroud's secrets lay exposed. Stroud had no idea how close the net was closing around him, how many layers had been peeled back to reveal the truth. But Holmes knew that the final act of the drama was about to unfold, and it would be Stroud's choice whether to meet it with a confession or with violence. "The question is not whether Stroud knows we are here," Holmes replied, his voice low, "but whether he is ready to do what he's already planned to do." Lestrade frowned, unsure of what Holmes meant, but before he could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. The detectives exchanged a quick glance, knowing the moment had arrived. Randolph Stroud was here. He had known they would come. And now, faced with the truth, he had no other option but to confront the consequences of his actions. Holmes calmly crossed the room, his every step deliberate. The door creaked open, and Stroud entered, his sharp features drawn into a tight expression of barely contained fury. He stopped short when he saw Holmes standing there, his posture rigid, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the doorframe. "You've come," Stroud said, his voice a mixture of resignation and defiance. "I suppose it was inevitable." Holmes did not flinch, his eyes piercing through Stroud with unflinching resolve. You've hidden behind your wealth, your influence, your secrets for too long. It's over, Stroud. The truth is out. Stroud's lip curled into a sneer. Truth? He spat. You think you've uncovered the truth. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Holmes. You don't know what's at stake here. Holmes stepped closer, his every movement measured, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I know enough. I know that your sister's death was no accident. I know that you've done everything in your power to bury the truth of her murder. But no more. Stroud's eyes flickered with something. Fear, perhaps, or the realization that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it. He took a step back, his hand brushing the pocket of his coat. Holmes noticed it immediately, the faint glint of something metallic hidden in his grasp. Holmes's eyes locked onto the object, a small, gleaming revolver. Stroud had come prepared, just in case. Careful, Stroud, Holmes warned, his voice calm but firm. You're only digging yourself deeper. For a moment there was silence, thick, heavy and taut, with the tension of what was about to unfold. Stroud's eyes darted nervously to the door, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. His mind raced, plotting his next move, but it was clear that his options were limited. He was trapped. I had no choice, Stroud said suddenly, his voice low and strained. You don't understand. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about power. It was about survival. She was going to ruin everything. Holmes tilted his head. His curiosity piqued. Who, Stroud? Who was going to ruin everything? Stroud's hand tightened around the revolver, but he didn't raise it yet. His shoulders sagged, and for a fleeting moment it seemed as though he might crumble under the weight of his guilt. Elizabeth. She was going to tell the world. She knew everything. She knew about the pact, about the crime, about what we did. Lestrade stepped forward, his voice sharp. You killed your own sister? Stroud's lips curled into something resembling a grimace. She wasn't my sister anymore. Not after she betrayed us. She was going to expose us all. The pact. The murder we covered up, everything. And we couldn't let her. Holmes's eyes narrowed. But the others? Why weren't they involved in her death? Stroud let out a hollow laugh, but there was no joy in it. They were all too weak, too afraid. Only I had the courage to do what had to be done. They would have hesitated, they would have tried to stop me, and that couldn't happen. Holmes's mind raced as Stroud's confession unfolded. Everything made sense now, the murders, the motives, the twisted sense of duty that had led Stroud to take such drastic actions. But there was still one question hanging in the air. Why the need for the Golden Dagger? I know what you're thinking, Stroud said, his voice tinged with bitter amusement. You're wondering about the dagger, the symbol, why the ritual. But it's simple, really. It was a message. A reminder that those who betrayed us would be erased, as if they never existed. The dagger was a tool of control, of power. It was meant to strike fear into those who would consider crossing me. Holmes stepped closer, never breaking his gaze. You've already lost, Stroud. The truth is out, and your past is now your downfall. The evidence is irrefutable. Stroud's eyes darkened, and in a flash he raised the revolver. But before he could make a move, Holmes lunged forward with lightning speed. In one swift motion, he knocked the weapon from Stroud's hand, sending it skittering across the floor. Stroud stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "You think you've won, Holmes? You think you can just walk away from this?" Holmes stood firm, his eyes steady, his voice cold. "The only thing I've done, Stroud, is ensure that you'll never hurt anyone again. You've had your chance to escape, but you failed. And now, you will face the consequences of your actions." With a final look of bitter defiance, Stroud slumped against the wall, his hands trembling. He had been caught, not just by Holmes, but by the truth he could no longer outrun. The trap had been set, and he had walked straight into it. As the authorities arrived to take him into custody, Holmes looked at Lestrade, who was still processing the weight of everything they had uncovered. For Holmes, the case was over, but the unsettling truth would linger for some time. Sometimes the darkest secrets were buried in the deepest corners of the past, and it was only through persistence, patience, and a steady hand that they could be dragged out into the light. But, for now at least, the puzzle was complete. The game was over. As Stroud was taken away in handcuffs, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. The room that had once been charged with dread now felt oddly empty. Holmes stood in the corner, observing, his thoughts already shifting toward the next steps. He had solved the case, uncovered the deepest secrets of the Stroud family, and secured the arrest of the man responsible for the string of murders. It was a satisfying conclusion, one that promised closure for the victims and their families. Lestrade stepped forward, a slight smile on his face, though his eyes still carried the weight of everything they had just uncovered. "I have to admit, Holmes, I didn't think we'd get here." "You were right, all along." Holmes gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze distant. "It is never about being right, Lestrade. It's about understanding the mind of the criminal and letting the evidence speak for itself. The truth has a way of revealing itself when you look in the right places." Lestrade continued to watch as the officers escorted Stroud away, and for a brief moment Holmes let himself feel the rare comfort of knowing the case was closed. But something still nagged at him, a sense of unease that refused to leave him. The sound of footsteps faded into the distance. The finality of it all seemed too neat, too clean. Holmes didn't believe in neat conclusions. There was always something left behind, some small, overlooked detail that could pull everything apart if you weren't paying attention. He looked at Lestrade, who was still lost in the final moments of the case's resolution. "Lestrade," Holmes said quietly, pulling his attention back to the present. "Something doesn't sit right with me." Lestrade turned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean? We caught Stroud. We have the confession. It's over." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he stared at the door through which Stroud had just passed. "You're mistaken, my dear Lestrade. This is not over. Not yet." Before Lestrade could respond, Holmes was already moving toward the table in the corner of the room. The papers, the documents, the photographs. Holmes had combed through them all, every last shred of evidence. But now he was searching for something he hadn't noticed before. Something small, something that seemed innocuous at first, but now screamed at him from the shadows. A sheet of paper lay partially hidden under a stack of files. It was crumpled, as if it had been hastily discarded. Holmes reached for it, smoothing it out with precise movements. His eyes flicked over the content, a simple list of names, some scribbled in haste, others crossed out with thick black lines, and in the margin an unfamiliar symbol, a single letter, an X. Holmes's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any list. It was a list of names connected to the Stroud family, but not in the way they had believed. Stroud had been the obvious choice, the one everyone had focused on. But this list suggested a much deeper conspiracy, one that ran far beyond his own guilt. Lestrade had followed him to the table by now, leaning over his shoulder to see what had captured Holmes's attention. "What is this? Who are these people?" Holmes remained silent for a moment, taking in the names on the list. His mind began to race, the connections forming faster than he could process. He had seen the names before. They were connected to the Stroud family's dealings, but not in a way that made sense within the framework of Stroud's guilt. No, this list was different. It was a record of people who had been eliminated, erased, or simply disappeared. And there at the bottom was one name he hadn't expected: Elizabeth Stroud. Lestrade stared at him. "But Elizabeth is dead. We know that. You solved her murder. Or so we thought," Holmes muttered, a cold realization creeping over him. "Elizabeth Stroud never died in that fire." Lestrade recoiled, his eyes wide. "What are you saying? How could she not?" Holmes held up a hand, cutting him off. "What if it wasn't a murder? What if it was an elaborate ruse to make everyone believe Elizabeth had been killed so she could disappear and continue her work in the shadows?" "Impossible," Lestrade objected, though doubt had already crept into his voice. Holmes looked at him, the weight of his conclusion heavy in his gaze. "It's the only explanation that fits. Elizabeth Stroud was behind everything, not Randolph. She orchestrated the entire scheme, the murders, the disappearances, everything. She manipulated her brother, used him as a pawn in her game. The Golden Dagger, the murders, even the final stage of Stroud's arrest. It was all designed to lead us here, to make us think we had it all figured out. And all the while, Elizabeth was watching from the sidelines." Lestrade's face twisted in disbelief. "But why? Why would she do this? What was the point?" Holmes took a deep breath, feeling the magnitude of the revelation settle around him. Elizabeth wanted to control the Stroud fortune. She wanted to erase everyone who stood in her way, to create a new legacy for herself. She was the mastermind, and Randolph, her own brother, was the perfect scapegoat. But she's dead. You said so yourself," Lestrade protested. Holmes looked down at the crumpled list once more. Perhaps she was never dead at all. Perhaps she staged it all. The fire, the supposed death, the subsequent mourning. She disappeared, and in the chaos that followed, she waited, watched, bided her time. Stroud was just a pawn in her game, an unfortunate fool who played right into her hands. Lestrade stared at him, still grappling with the weight of the new revelation. "And you think she's still out there?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He had to think. There were too many pieces falling into place now, too many threads pulling at him, demanding to be understood. He looked up at Lestrade, his eyes steely with determination. "The game isn't over, not yet. Elizabeth Stroud is still out there, and she's been manipulating us all from the beginning. We'll need to find her before she can make her next move." Lestrade nodded, but there was a trace of apprehension in his face. "And how do we find her?" Holmes's lips curled into a small, calculating smile. "That, my dear Lestrade, is where we begin. It's time to turn the tables." The detective was already lost in thought, planning his next move. The case was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic investigation. Holmes and Lestrade retraced every step, re-examining the evidence with a newfound urgency. The realization that Elizabeth Stroud was still alive had turned everything upside down. Every conversation, every suspect, every seemingly insignificant detail now took on new weight. They'd missed something crucial, a thread that should have been pulled long ago. Holmes stood in the middle of the room, staring at the map of London pinned to the wall. Dozens of locations were marked, places the Stroud family had frequented, places where suspicious activities had occurred. He had pieced together a pattern, a web of locations that led nowhere, or perhaps, as he now suspected, everywhere. "Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room. "We need to act swiftly. Elizabeth Stroud is a master of manipulation. She has been orchestrating everything from the shadows. We cannot allow her to slip through our fingers." Lestrade looked up from the documents he'd been scanning. "But where would she go? What's her next move?" Holmes's eyes gleamed as a slow smile tugged at his lips. "That's the question, isn't it? She's always been careful, hiding in plain sight. But there's one thing she's overlooked: her own ego." Lestrade frowned, unsure of what Holmes meant. "Her ego?" "She wants recognition, Lestrade. She's been playing a dangerous game, but her actions have been far from subtle. The Golden Dagger, the murders, the long con with her brother. It's all been to position her at the center of attention. But now, she's desperate for the final act. She'll want to show the world that she's the one pulling the strings. It's her pride, her need for validation. That's where we'll find her." Holmes turned back to the map, tracing a line between two key locations: a private estate on the outskirts of the city and a seemingly innocent warehouse in the industrial district. "She'll be there," Holmes said. "I'm certain of it." Lestrade hesitated, his gaze flicking between Holmes and the map. "But that's a huge risk, Holmes. If she's as dangerous as you say, we're walking right into her trap." Holmes's smile remained steady, though there was a cold edge to it. "That's exactly what we want. Let her think she's in control. We'll be the ones who turn the tables." The two men wasted no time. The evening light had already begun to fade as they set out in separate directions. Holmes took the lead, trusting his instincts, knowing that the clues were all converging. Every piece had fallen into place, and now it was time for the final confrontation. They met in the heart of the industrial district. The warehouse loomed like a monolithic shadow in the darkening night. It was quiet, almost eerily so. Holmes could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the culmination of everything. The case that had started with an impossible crime, a series of twists and turns, was about to reach its explosive conclusion. Lestrade stayed back, allowing Holmes to approach the entrance alone. He trusted his friend's judgment. Holmes had been right so far. He only hoped that the detective was as prepared for this confrontation as he claimed. Holmes stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with precision. The space was vast, empty, save for a few scattered crates. The faint smell of oil and rust filled the air. There was a quiet hum of machinery in the distance, but nothing that suggested immediate danger. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew the lay of the land, who had already anticipated what was to come. And then he heard it, a soft footstep, followed by the faintest rustle. Holmes's heart quickened, but he didn't flinch. He turned sharply to face the source of the sound, his eyes narrowing as a figure stepped out from the shadows. Elizabeth Stroud. She was dressed in a dark, nondescript outfit, her hair concealed under a cap. But there was no mistaking her cold, calculating gaze, the same one that had watched from the sidelines as the pieces of her plan fell into place. She smiled, a dangerous curve of her lips that sent a chill through the air. "Well done, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and steady. "I must admit I didn't expect you to find me so quickly." Holmes remained silent for a moment, taking in her presence. She was as poised as ever, but the slightest flicker of something, fear perhaps, or guilt, crossed her eyes. It was a crack in her carefully constructed facade, and Holmes seized on it immediately. "I knew from the start that it couldn't be Randolph," Holmes replied, his voice calm, almost disinterested. "He was a puppet, nothing more, and when I found that list of names, I knew the truth. You were never dead, Elizabeth. You orchestrated your own death to throw us off your scent." Elizabeth's smile faltered, just a fraction. "I suppose you're right, Holmes. I couldn't let anyone stand in the way of what I wanted. My brother, the family, none of them mattered. Only the legacy I was creating for myself." Her confession was chilling in its simplicity. It wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about control, about rewriting history, about making her mark in a world that had always overlooked her. But why the murders? Why go to such extremes? Lestrade's voice broke through the silence as he stepped forward, his presence like a physical weight behind Holmes. Elizabeth glanced at him, her eyes flashing with disdain. "People get in the way, Detective, and when they do, they must be removed. I had no choice. I had a future to build, a future that doesn't belong to anyone else." Holmes shook his head slowly, disappointment lacing his voice. "You failed to see the most obvious truth, Elizabeth. The one thing that would have stopped you cold from the start." "And what is that?" Elizabeth asked, almost taunting. "That there is no such thing as a perfect crime." Holmes took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You thought you could control everything, but you forgot that your actions leave traces. Every lie, every manipulation, every murder, it all leaves a mark. You just didn't think anyone would find it." Elizabeth's eyes hardened. "And what now, Holmes? Do you plan to arrest me?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with a strange, almost pitying gaze. "You've already lost. Whether you're arrested or not is irrelevant. You've shown the world who you are, and in the end, that's the most devastating punishment of all." A beat passed, thick with tension, before Elizabeth's expression faltered again. For the first time, there was a flicker of fear, of recognition, in her eyes. She had underestimated Holmes, underestimated everything. And in that instant, Holmes saw it, saw the last vestiges of her carefully constructed control crack. But just as he stepped forward to close the distance, to finally bring the conclusion to a long-awaited end, a sharp noise shattered the moment. Gunfire. Holmes ducked instinctively, the sound ringing in his ears as Elizabeth darted behind a stack of crates. A desperate move, but one that spoke volumes. Lestrade was already drawing his weapon, but Holmes moved first, pushing him back. "No," he murmured. "She'll slip through our fingers again if we chase her. Let her go. This is over. She's already lost." They both stood in the aftermath, the tension dissolving slowly, the gunshot still ringing in the distance. Elizabeth had escaped, again. Justice had not been served, but it had never been her justice to claim. Holmes and Lestrade stood in the shadows of the warehouse, the echoes of the gunshot still reverberating in the air. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The usual cacophony of London streets muted as the silence of the unresolved hung over them. Holmes' sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the remnants of their pursuit. Broken crates, the faint trail of blood leading nowhere, the scattered debris left behind by their elusive quarry. "She's gone, then," Lestrade said, his voice tinged with a mix of frustration and resignation. "Yes," Holmes replied, his tone cold yet steady. "But she's not the one who worries me now." Lestrade glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the shadows, his mind still whirring through the tangled threads of the case. There was something off, something he had missed in the chaos of the final moments. His thoughts returned to the key evidence that had slipped through his fingers, the cryptic message left behind by Elizabeth Stroud just before she made her escape. It had been a single line, hastily scribbled on a piece of paper found in her office. "The truth is buried in the past, and the past never stays buried." It had seemed like a rambling delusion at the time, a final attempt to throw him off, but now, in the stillness of the moment, it gnawed at him. The phrase echoed in his mind, reverberating with an unsettling finality. "The past never stays buried." He turned away from Lestrade, his eyes narrowing as he walked toward the exit of the warehouse. "There is still more to this, Lestrade. We may have cornered Elizabeth Stroud, but I'm afraid we've only touched the surface." Lestrade followed, his footsteps slow and heavy. "What do you mean, Holmes? The case is as good as closed. We know she's behind it all." Holmes stopped just outside the warehouse, his gaze shifting to the skyline of London, now bathed in the soft glow of the moon. "Do we? What we've uncovered here is only a small piece of the puzzle. The Stroud family, Elizabeth Randolph, they were only pawns. The real mastermind, the one who set all of this in motion, is someone far more dangerous than we've realized." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "But who? We've questioned everyone." Holmes shook his head. "The pieces have been placed too perfectly, Lestrade. The killings, the manipulations, the long con with her brother. It all fits together too neatly. Elizabeth may have orchestrated the murders, but someone else has been pulling her strings. And I believe they're still out there." Lestrade didn't respond at first, allowing Holmes' words to sink in. The detective had never been one to speak in riddles, and when he did, it meant something far more troubling than anyone could imagine. "I think I've figured it out," Holmes continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Golden Dagger. It was never about the money. It was about control, power, and someone who has been in the shadows for far longer than we've imagined. Someone who's been waiting for this moment." Lestrade looked at him, his expression growing more confused with each word. "But who? Who could have manipulated Elizabeth Stroud like this?" Holmes didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned toward the direction of the Stroud estate. His mind raced, recalling every interaction, every statement made by the suspects. There had been a few, just a few moments that had stood out, details that didn't quite fit, conversations that had seemed almost rehearsed. But now, the picture was becoming clearer. A name, a figure from the past kept resurfacing in his thoughts, like a whisper in the dark. "I need to see someone," Holmes said suddenly, his voice filled with quiet urgency. "There's one person who knows more about this than they're letting on." Lestrade glanced at him, still unsure of where Holmes was going with this. But he knew better than to question the detective at this point. He simply nodded, falling into step beside him. The two of them moved through the streets of London in silence, the city now feeling more like a labyrinth than ever before. The flickering gas lamps illuminated their path, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Holmes was deep in thought, his mind racing through the evidence they had gathered, while Lestrade watched him closely, wondering where this final revelation would lead. It wasn't long before they arrived at their destination, a small, unassuming bookshop tucked away in a narrow alley. Holmes paused at the entrance, his fingers brushing the door handle before he pushed it open. The scent of old paper and dust greeted them as they stepped inside. Behind the counter, an elderly man with round spectacles looked up, his face lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice soft but steady. "What brings you here at this hour?" Turning it over in his hands. "It holds the key to everything." Lestrade stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the cover. It was an obscure history of the Stroud family, one that had been published long before Elizabeth Stroud had even been born. Holmes flipped it open, his fingers tracing the yellowed pages. The Stroud family didn't simply come into wealth by chance, Lestrade. Their fortune was built on something far darker, something that connects them to a series of events stretching back decades. But what I'm looking for isn't here. Lestrade frowned, trying to make sense of Holmes's cryptic words. "Then what are we looking for?" Holmes paused, his gaze lingering on the page before him. A name that has been hidden from public view. The true architect of the Stroud family's rise to power. Holmes closed the book with a soft thud, his eyes narrowing once more. "The past, Lestrade. It's never truly buried. It's simply waiting to resurface." As he turned to leave, Lestrade could see the shadows of uncertainty on Holmes' face. The case that had once seemed so straightforward was now a vast ocean of unanswered questions, and they had only scratched the surface. There were still pieces of the puzzle left, fragments of the story that had yet to be told. As Holmes stepped into the night, Lestrade could feel the weight of what lay ahead. The final confrontation with Elizabeth Stroud had ended, but another mystery was already beginning to unfold, one that promised to be far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. And though the case was technically over, Lestrade knew that the true journey had only just begun.